Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Manjula Bashmi, Associate Professor in English, welcoming all to the fourth day International Virtual Talk Series of Ecocriticism, a Green Revolution in Literature by Dr. Chitra Shankaran. Dr. Chitra is an Associate Professor and the Deputy Head and Chair for Literature in the Department of English Language Literature, National University of Singapore. Dr. Chitra's teaching interests rest in the areas of eco-criticism, post-colonial literature, and feminist theory, and her research interests include ecological criticism, with a special reference to ecofeminism, deep ecology, and post-humanism, South Asian fiction in English, Southeast Asian women fiction, gender studies, feminist pedagogy, feminist ethics and aesthetics, comparative literature. And she has been honored with many teaching awards for her excellence in teaching. And to name a few, she has been awarded with Faculty Teaching Excellence Award, Department Faculty Teaching Excellence Award, University Scholars Program Teaching Excellence Award. In addition, more than a couple of times, she has been awarded with Visiting Research Fellowship from the University of London. And to her credit, Dr. Chitra has published more than 20 research articles, monographs, 18 book chapters, and one interesting novel titled A Void of Reason, a murder mystery novel. And she also served in many editorial committees. And for today's session, we have Dr. Chitra with us to illuminate us on eco-criticism. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Manjula, for your very kind introduction. I'm very grateful for the warmth with which you have welcomed me. And I only hope that today will be an interesting and constructive experience for you and all the people who are listening in. So, would you like me to start now lecturing?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
So let me share screen then. It's always a pleasure to meet with new audiences and to have an exchange of ideas. So I hope today will be productive for all of us. So begin with the screen here now. So today my talk introduces you to the broad field of environmental humanities, and more specifically to the field of ecological criticism, or eco-criticism for short. So my talk today will take you to the background to ecological studies in literature. I will discuss some definitions of eco-criticism. I will talk about the significance of this field of study, developments, some subfields. I will talk about the first wave of eco-criticism, the second wave, and then I will discuss the significance of the differences that emerge. There might be overlaps. It will not perhaps be in the same order, but it'll, I hope, make sense to you as I go through the various ideas. So, to begin with, one of the interesting aspects of literary studies is that it has always responded to developments in the world, right? We say literature holds a mirror up to the world, and that's said with a reason. Um, this is not particularly surprising as well when one realizes that literary texts also mediate the real through their literary creations, right? Whether it is war, whether it is a pandemic, a local or a global crisis, literary texts mediate and meditate upon their reality for their readers. So, interestingly, even as we emphasize that literature demands the suspension of disbelief when you enter its portals, you also realize that paradoxically, the most pressing literary and cultural texts are those that speak to a reality that you cognize. For example, Avatar by James Cameron, it's a very famous film. I'm sure many of you have watched it. Or even Ursula Le Guin's the very famous science fiction novel, The Word for World is Forest, are both fantasies. They are both set in another planet. Yet they are compelling to us because their themes engage with themes that are very topical and they speak to us. So they engage with colonialism, the problems of colonial exploitation. They talk about militarization. They talk about deforestation, human attitudes to non human nature, and so forth. So, because of this, it becomes important for us to understand that literature speaks to a reality. Now, the most pressing global crisis in recent times, one that has gradually grown upon us over decades, unlike the COVID pandemic that has come upon us so suddenly, is global warming. This has led to the global environmental crisis. This has become a time for reviewing the field in order to understand ways in which literary studies has related to nature. For the longest time, while global warming was becoming a preeminent topic for analysis and discussion in many fields, literary studies appeared to be oblivious of this growing global catastrophe. Instead, it appeared mired in the abstractions of critical theory and or the tautologies of postmodern ethics. It was only in the late 20th century that literary studies appeared to fully wake up to the global environmental crisis. This was when eco criticism as a field came into being. So, eco criticism came to be formalized as a field of study in 1992 with the creation of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, usually known by its acronym ASLE. So, ASLE is an international organization. We have a chapter in Southeast Asia. It is called ASLE ASEAN. There's also a chapter in India. I'm sure you're aware of it, those of you who are interested in eco criticism. So, eco criticism is known by many names. It is called green studies, sometimes they used to call it eco poetics. It is informed by other fields such as ecology, biopolitics, geography. So, it is an interdisciplinary field. So, the Western environmentalist movement had its beginnings in the late 19th century with its rich nature writings. The American nature writers, known as transcendentalists, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, Henry David Thoreau, were sensitive to nature. In the 1960s, again, there was a renewed ecological consciousness. The first significant eco critical study was by Joseph Meeker, and this was published in the 70s. So it was published in 1974. This was also when the term eco criticism was coined by William Ruckert in 1978 and it gradually came into vogue. Ruckert defined eco-criticism as the application of ecology and ecological concepts to the study of literature. Right? So this has come to be touted as one of the standing definitions of eco-criticism. Now, speaking about Western culture, that is, in reference to Western culture, Christopher Maines observes that nature is silent in our culture and in literate societies generally, in the sense that the status of being a speaking subject is jealously guarded as an exclusively human prerogative. Maines attributes this human arrogance to the legacies of Renaissance and Enlightenment humanism. Right? Now, I want to pause here to, to remind all of us that though we say that language is a human attribute, that is not quite the case. There are a lot of scientists and scientific studies that are emerging these days which say that birds, for instance, and dolphins have extremely sophisticated ways of communicating, right? And therefore, the idea of a speaking subject, which has been a very anthropocentric or human centric concept, is really not something that can hold up as the truth, right? So when Maynes talks about the legacies of Renaissance and Enlightenment humanism, and this is an idea that also Elschleger talks about. We are people who presumably think of the world in terms of the learned categorical schemes of modernism. It is as if we had compressed the entire buzzing, howling, gurgling biosphere into the narrow vocabulary of epistemology, to the point that someone like George Lukács could say nature is a societal category and actually be understood. So, this shows the irony, the fact that nature had so lost its autonomy that human beings could actually talk about nature as a societal category, or in other words, as something that is part of culture. So, nature over the centuries had been effectively silenced by man. Right? Now, remember that in the Western context, humanism, which was part of the post Enlightenment legacy, in its anxiety to promote human agency and autonomy, removing humans from their medieval pre Enlightenment placement as pawns to supernatural powers, went about completely subordinating non human agency. So, this was the problem. And this is also, you might recall, the foundational ideology behind colonialism, right? And we find that at some point, anthropocentrism, that is human centered thinking, and Eurocentrism, that is European centered thinking, coalesced, that is, it came together, right? Now, whether it is an ancient text emerging from the east or the west, like Iliad or Odyssey, Ramayana or Mahabharata, we realize that the non human world is treated as animated and agentic in older texts, right? In pre medieval texts. But modern industrialized world has become increasingly deaf, you could say, to non-human nature. I use this phrase very deliberately when I say non human nature because we humans have forgotten that we are a part of nature. We are embedded in nature and we are not outside of it. So, for animistic cultures which see the natural world as inspirited, we still have aborigines in Africa, many tribals. We have the tribals in Nicobar Islands and Andaman Islands, and we have also the Native Americans, right, who used to be called Red Indians. Now they are Native Americans. All of these cultures are still animistic cultures. There are some Amazonian tribes which are animistic, which see the natural world as inspirited. And this is not an idea that is alien to us. It is an idea that has lived on in our culture, right? Not just people are seen as inspirited, but also animals, plants, and even inert entities like stones and rivers are perceived as being articulate and at times intelligible subjects, able to communicate and interact with humans for good or ill. Right? The fact that in India, all the rivers, except for Brahmaputra, all the rivers are feminized, says something about the agency that we give to these so called inanimate entities. Right? Again, for animistic cultures, language is not limited to humans. There is a language of birds, the wind, wolves, water, And this is a world of autonomous speakers that the rest of nature is attuned to. So there's this remarkable study I came across where an ornithologist, a person who studies birds and their movements, talks about how for 30 years he tracked the movement of a whole flock of birds who migrated from Britain all the way to New Zealand. Right? And one of the remarkable things he found over the course of his study of over 2 decades is that when uh, every time the birds changed their migratory pattern, that is, instead of leaving at a particular specified time of the year, if they left earlier, it usually turned out that that was a year when there was a great natural disaster in their path. So somewhere in the ocean that they were crossing, if there was going to be a huge typhoon or some such natural disaster, those years the flock of birds actually changed their migratory patterns and flew earlier in the year, which meant that they never ever got caught out by these natural disasters. So, what does this mean? That there is a world of autonomous speakers that the rest of nature is attuned to, and probably something that our forefathers in the old Stone Age or the new Stone Age were attuned to because it was necessary for their survival. But we have become so arrogant and so insular in our perspective that we have become deaf to the sounds of nature. The world that was pre industrial, right, was a world where humans were attuned to, at least partially, to the sound of nature. Now, coming to a slightly different point, it is important to recognize the fact that to regard nature as alive and articulate has consequences in the realm of social practices. Michel Foucault discusses how social power operates through a regime of privileged speakers who are vested with authority, right? Such as kings, priests, authors, doctors, teachers, and so forth. Now, this means that these privileged speakers, right, are used to the idea of power, so, and authority. And therefore, this means that humans as a whole, as a group, have also become used to the idea of authority. So, we have to therefore add to this list the foundational unit called the human species as a whole. Human species has come to regard itself as the privileged soliloquist of the entire planet Earth, right? So you find that when you talk about kings versus subjects, priests versus followers or worshippers, authors versus readers, doctors versus patients, teachers versus students, we are talking about what is generally known as hierarchical dualism. I'm not sure if you've come across the term. Hierarchical dualism means that when you have binaries, one side of the binary is considered the positive and the other side of the binary is the negative. So you have the self other binary. Right? In colonialism, this was a very central binary. Europeans showed up as an SHORED, showed up their self image of their European self, right, by othering natives. So they would say we are rational by considering or imposing the image of superstition and backwardness on the natives, right, on the colonized, right? So reason, science, and so forth were accrued on the side of the Europeans, and the negative qualities were generally imposed upon the natives, right? So therefore, that is what you call hierarchical dualism. right? And these binaries still prevail to a large extent. They prevail, right? Um, and of course, we have the silenced subaltern women, minorities, children, prisoners, the insane. These are all generally the silenced. And to this hierarchical dualism, we need to add one more, that is the privileged humans versus the underprivileged non human nature. Right? Now, one of the reasons why nature has been so effectively silenced is because nature is perceived as existing outside human conversations, unable to participate in it. Right? Nature does not enter the discursive field of humans. And as Hans Peter Duer points out, people do not exploit a nature that speaks to them. One early and important ethical philosophy within eco-criticism is deep ecology, right? The rationalist, logo is the word, right? So word-centered discourse of humanism, right? Deep ecologists believe has muted the multiple voices of nature. We have lost the ability to listen, deep ecologists point out. Nature spoke to our ancestors. It still speaks to us, but we're not listening to it. It speaks to us through forest fires, through a typhoon, right? It is telling us something very important about our current relationship with our environment, right? Companies, and this is interesting, you'll find this interesting. Companies like Flight Aware keep track of all the aircraft in the skies. Right now, obviously, this year, lockdown, hardly any aircraft in the air. So, did you know that in 2019, they tracked an average of 9,740 planes flying the skies all over the planet at any one point in time? I'm talking about a minute or less. 9,740 planes plied the skies in 2019 at any one point in time. So just imagine the kind of desecration of nature that we as humans have been um, involved in, engaged in, right? And if there's one thing that the lockdown has taught us, it has taught us that without traveling, we can achieve a lot of things. I hope that lesson will last, but I don't know. I doubt it, right? So, therefore, eco criticism emerged as a field that attempts to redress the excesses of theorization within literature. It questions the preeminence accorded to logic and reason. It challenges the superiority of the human species, right? And Peter Singer, an animal liberationist, calls this speciesism. Just like we talk about feminism, we talk about Marxism, which is about class, we talk about classism, right, which is about class, we talk about ageism, which is about age, right? Here, he talks about speciesism, that is the kind of discriminatory practice of speciesism where we hold the human species preeminent as opposed to all the other species on planet Earth. And he questions it. Peter Singer questions it. He says, what gives us the right to believe that we are the preeminent species on Earth? Right? So, eco criticism bemoans the fact that human culture has worked to separate us from nature rather than acknowledging our embedment in it. Right? Eco critics believe that all these attitudes have brought about our planetary destruction. Therefore, it becomes the role of eco criticism to review our way and foster a greater harmony between culture and nature. Now, eco critics ask, where has logic and reason, the so called superior attributes of humanity, led us? It has led us to two world wars, to many other wars that are still going on in different parts of the world. It has led us to systems of government that appear either inept or corrupt, with very few exceptions, right? It has shown us that whatever the form of government, whether it's monarchy, whether it's anarchy, whether it's democracy, whether it's authoritarian, all seem defective, right, at this point in time. Where has logic and reason led us? It has led us to a nuclear arms race. Right? So, eco critics believe that Green Studies initiative should address social problems that compromise our relationship with non human nature. So, Cheryl Glotfelty defines eco-criticism as the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. Just as feminist criticism examines language and literature from a gender conscious perspective, and Marxist criticism brings an awareness of modes of production and economic class to its reading of literary and other cultural texts. Eco criticism takes on an earth centered approach to literary studies. So initially, eco-criticism began with basics, right? Early eco-critics dealt with questions such as what is the role of the physical setting of this novel, right? Or does this play or fiction display ecological sensitivity? Is it sensitive about the environment, about local ecologies, about planetary ecologies? What kind of ecological metaphors can be discerned, and how do they affect our response to the literary text? Right? Overall, in addition to race, class, and gender, place becomes another very important critical category. Right? So, as the scope of eco criticism broadened, the interconnections between nature and culture, specifically, and the cultural artifacts of language and literature became a focus of study. Glotfelty describes this in a slightly dramatic way when he says a critical stance that has one foot in literature and the other on land. As a theoretical discourse, eco criticism negotiates between the human and the non human. Right? Now, eco critics believe in James Lovelock's initial thesis of Gaia Theory. I don't know if you know of this, but in the 1960s and 70s, James Lovelock was involved in a scientific project in NASA, right? And he came up with this Gaia theory. And what is this theory? Of course, subsequently, over the past 5 or 6 decades, Gaia theory has come to be critiqued, qualified, nuanced, expanded, right? But it has not been completely dismissed. So, what is this Gaia theory? This essentially believes that our planet Earth, here named Gaia after the Greek earth goddess Gaia. I believe the name was suggested by William Golding, who was a close friend of James Lovelock. He's of course, a Nobel laureate in literature. You might have read his book, right? Lord of the Flies. So he's a very famous novelist. So it was William Golding who suggested the name Gaia after the Greek earth goddess. So, what is Gaia theory? James Lovelock postulated that Gaia is a self regulating organism. Our planet Earth is a self regulating organism. Subsequent theories that have come up, scientific studies, the chaos theory, for instance, talks about planetary interconnections, right? So, when a butterfly flutters its wings, you get a typhoon. So, those kinds of stupendous planetary interconnections have been postulated and posited by various theories that have come up. right? Now, one simple example, right? A scientific study that has borne this out, that Earth is a self-regulating organism, is that did you know that the ocean salinity has remained at 3% for millennia? So you might ask, what has regulated salinity in the oceans? Why hasn't it risen to 4%? Why hasn't it fallen to 2%? Well, it has scientific studies have found out that there are cracks in the ocean bed that actually desalinate the water when the salt levels increase and keep it at a steady 3%. So the fish in the water and aquatic life can continue. Right? So, therefore, Lovelock was not wrong in postulating that our planet is a self regulating organism, right? So all of these ideas have come to the fore in eco-criticism, and we can broadly classify them as first wave and second wave eco-criticism. Diverse schools have emerged in the field of ecological criticism or green studies, and we look at a few of them now. We have deep ecology, shallow ecology, earth movement, ecofeminism, post-colonial eco-criticism, eco-justice or environmental justice, and so forth. And we'll be examining uh, a few of them, though we don't have the time to go into great depth. So, first wave eco criticism is a study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment, right? In the 1960s, conservationists and writers began raising public awareness of environmental dangers. An outstanding example is Rachel Carson, a marine biologist from Pennsylvania in the United States of America. Right? Her two famous works were The Edge of the Sea in 1955 and The Silent Spring in 1962. Now, you find that what she does is to introduce a very ancient skill that was fundamental to literary studies and was considered one of the foundational literary skills in Greek classical era and medieval era, and that was rhetoric, rhetorical skills. So, what do we understand by rhetorical skills? By rhetorical skills, we are talking about the idea of the art of persuasion. The art of persuasion. For the longest time, literary studies was mired in theory. It was mired in Russian formalism, examining American formalism. It was mired in modernism, postmodernism. It was talking about structuralism, post structuralism, and it let go. And of course, there was a deep skepticism to grand narratives and to essentialized identities, so much so that Gayatri Spivak actually had to introduce the term is a strategic essentialism to even talk about any kind of a universal identity, right? So where would literature have been interested in the grandest narrative of all, that is global warming, right? So therefore it let go of rhetorical skills, but eco-criticism realized that it had to rediscover rhetorical skills, the art of persuasion, to persuade people, hang on a minute, our planet is in crisis. You need to pay attention to it. Forget about being mired in theory alone. Give importance to the real world around you, the real ecological problems that we are facing, right? So we now look at Rachel Carson as an exemplary American conservationist, right, who in the first half of the 20th century used the skill of rhetorical analysis to raise environmental awareness, right? Now, uh, notice this passage from The Silent Spring. There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. The town lay in the midst of a checkerboard of prosperous farms, with fields of grain and hillsides of orchards, where, in spring, white clouds of bloom drifted above the green fields. So this is how it begins. Okay, and this is builds up a world of harmony, an idyllic world where everything is in harmony, and we get this idea of a countryside where birds sing. There's a lovely kind of a peaceful farmland, fields of grain, and hillsides of orchards. So this is a very harmonious picture that she presents in the first part of the book. And then there is an abrupt turnabout. And she says, then a strange blight crept over the area, and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Notice the kind of uh, tone that she adopts. It's a fabular tone, a one that you use for a fable, right? Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chickens. The cattle and sheep sickened and died. Everywhere was the shadow of death. The farmers began to mourn the loss of their beloved. The fields became empty. Example of a focuses on the coastal ecosystems of eastern coast from Maine to Florida. And it appeared in the New Yorker in two condensed installments shortly before its publication, and was hugely influential. Companies, multinational companies. And therefore, what was the result? Many of these companies shifted from America to third world countries. We know about the Bhopal disaster, Union Carbide, right? And they just outsourced. So, and we were only now we are awaking to the problems of all these toxins in our environment, right? So, Rachel Carson was one of the first, what you might call pioneers in the field of consciousness raising. She was a conservationist, right? So, Silent Spring warns of the dangers to all natural systems from the misuse of chemical pesticides such as DDT. So, this book inspired a grassroots environmental movement that led to the creation of the US Environmental Protection Agency. Right? So, Rachel Carson, therefore, was one of the pioneering figures who kick-started an environmental awareness movement in the 1960s that led to the eco-critical movement of the 1980s. So Lawrence Buell discusses the first wave characterized by its emphasis on nature writing as an object of study and as a meaningful practice. First wave eco-critics saw it as the duty of both the humanities and the natural sciences to raise awareness and invent solutions for a problem that is both cultural and physical, in that it pertains to both nature and culture. So when we look at first wave, then we find that the first wave of eco-critics raised awareness about the diverse ways in which humans have become the greatest predators on Earth and how they have been exploiting nature relentlessly over the millennia. Thus, the first wave of eco critics diligently flagged up the nature culture binary, siding with nature. They saw this as a corrective to the overemphasis on theory and hence culture in literary studies. Right? The first wave of eco critics also established the political nature of eco criticism. Greg Garrett, in his Eco Criticism, which he published in 2004, calls it an avowedly political mode of analysis. But to balance this view, one does needs to also acknowledge the fact that in the first wave there was a tendency, a great to romanticize nature a great deal, right? So it was seen as an idyllic retreat, an abode of harmony. Nature was seen as a salve to our culture. So nature tended to romanticize it, nor did the first wave sufficiently reflect about human embedment in nature. Now, therefore, we come to the second wave. The second wave of eco critics questioned basic binaries such as nature, culture, human, and non human. They challenged such constructions, foundational religious texts came under scrutiny, especially from the Abrahamic religious traditions, which considered man as God's favored creation. But again, here they pointed out that while medieval Christianity saw human beings as stewards of nature, increasingly post humanism encouraged the view of looking at nature as something to be conquered by man rather than as something that needed to be tended by humans, right? And the Enlightenment legacy of humanism, therefore, came to be questioned. This iterated the preeminence of man, and I use the term deliberately since humanism and patriarchy worked in tandem through history. Right? We particularly know how colonialism was a very definite reflection of patriarchal modes of thought, right? So, patriarchal constructions of nature as passive and the conflation of nature and women as both being passive spaces under patriarchal purview came to be deconstructed, right? So, we have ecological feminists involved and engaged with this form of study, right? And of course, post colonial eco critics are engaged with the idea of how colonialism, right? Um, was engaged in the treatment of nature, and a colonial treatment of nature was reviewed under post colonial eco criticism. So they came up with the fact that nature was regulated and doctored extensively under colonialism. There was large scale disturbance of local ecologies that were challenged. So, during colonialism, for instance, local cattle were disregarded and they had Jersey cows brought to India, to South Asia, to Southeast Asia. Jersey cows were a completely different breed and their ecologies were not suited to the local ecologies, but they had great problems adjusting. Again, you find that plantation labor, all of these ecologies were disturbed during colonialism, right? So, in the Future of Environmental Criticism, published in 2005, Lawrence Buell distinguishes between first and second waves. He says 20th century environmental criticism was mostly engaged in analyzing nature writing, wilderness, and was engaged with American romantic traditions. So, this was the first wave. But the emerging works in the 21st century, that is the second wave, are increasingly concerned with topical environmental issues that are hard hitting, right? Political, and involves gender, urban, and class issues being examined. One absolute uh, instance of this is Rob Nixon's study, Slow Violence, Environmentalism of the Poor, right? Here, Nixon discusses how violence is not only visual and spectacular, like a tsunami or an earthquake or forest fires that we hear about, but violence can be gradual and accretional, right? Creating gradually increasing consequences degrading toxic environments, the of potable drinking water across India, right? It's a problem. Again, and this is not a problem unique to India. A lot of developing nations in the world are facing this problem. Increasing population has made this a problem. Again, the slow desertification of soil and therefore decreasing fertility of the soil is an instance of slow violence. Rise in sea levels is again an instance of slow violence. So we must remember that these first and second waves are not distinct but more an overview. Sometimes they do overlap. For example, activism, which continues today, is seen as a more distinct feature of first wave of eco-criticism, but we still have a lot of eco-warriors. Okay, so in the second wave, as our environmental crisis has been brewing for thousands of years, second wave environmental critics have not been engaged with just modern texts. Gradually industrializing Europe of the medieval eras already provide opportunities for eco-critics to examine human attitudes to the environment through history, right? So, therefore, environmental critics who are working with medieval and Renaissance texts are ideally positioned to explore the gradual rise of urban air pollution. They are able to examine the start of the agricultural era and the start of urbanization and so forth. In fact, Ramayana and Mahabharata are absolute testimonies about the rise of the gradual rise of urbanization in ancient India, and it gives us ample opportunities to examine this, in fact. Right? As such, the literatures of nearly all periods can be of interest to second wave eco critics as a way of helping us understand the emergence of our present environmental crisis. Right? Now, one of the interesting things that has emerged in the second wave is to identify criticism identifies six important concepts that engaging eco-critics in second wave. They are pollution, which is a very topical. All of us worldwide are dealing with the idea of pollution, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and so forth. Wilderness, it's also a very important trope. This was particularly important to American pioneer settlers who wrote a lot about wilderness. Right? Pastoral, as a cultural more, is an entrenched trope in canonical literature throughout the world. So we have Milton's Lycidas, right? This is a pastoral elegy that is set in a very idealized rural landscape full of nymphs and muses. There's a difference between wilderness and pastoral, right? Wilderness is more the untamed land, pastoral is more the domesticated landscape of the rural countryside. There is a difference. And then, of course, we have the trope of the apocalypse, which is the end of the world trope, right? Which is something that we keep coming up in films, in science fiction texts. So, apocalypse is a very important trope, the end of the world in eco criticism. Dwelling, our embedment in our planet. How do we learn to live in our planet? How do we continue to ensure that our planet is habitable? Right? So that is the trope that comes under dwelling. And animals, how do we live with our animals? How do we continue to ensure that our planet is habitable? How do we live with our animals? How do criticism? So all these have become very important. Now, institutions and ideologies have also come under scrutiny in the second wave. I've already mentioned about humanism, which has been critiqued for placing man as well as sexist as racist as well as homophobic. How do we live with our animals? connotations. When we say man, male, who was generally seen as the purveyor of life on earth. So the Eurocentric male, the European male with his Eurocentric vision was the, shall we say, the anthropologist, the historian, the purveyor of the rest of humanity, right? And colonialism was also criticized because of its civilizing landscapes, outsourcing resources because of its plantation culture. Patriarchy, conflating women and nature, constructing them both as passive and hence as requiring mastery. Classicism, richer nations of the world have pushed their dirty industries to the poorer nations. And again, modernity and globalization, the role of capitalism in modernity and how globalization of first and second waves. So let me quickly go through that again. Raised awareness about human and non-human binary, and it discussed, the first wave discussed the ways in which human treatment of nature has brought our planet to the brink of catastrophe. The second wave politicized and challenged the very binaries that the first wave took for granted. It questioned many institutions for the role they have played in the exploitation of nature. The various branches, this gave rise to several important branches of eco-criticism, which I've already made you familiar with: post-colonial eco-criticism, eco-feminism, and eco-justice or environmental justice, and urban ecologies, and so forth. Philosophically, one of the earliest philosophies that grew around the first wave of eco-criticism, in fact, you could say it started off eco-criticism, was deep ecology. This was followed by a slight variation, the shallow ecology, and by several other approaches to eco-criticism that I have mentioned earlier. So all of these are now opening up the field of green literatures to us, right? So this is where we stand. Okay. Is there is there
Thank you,
anything that
ma'am. Like it was a very extensive study and a very thought-provoking session, because
thank
we all are understanding the difficulties that we are facing because of all these ecological issues, and the present scenario itself is an example for that. So it I hope that you have like gone into the literature, and also you have given us an insight for how it has been viewed in the past, and how we are seeing the nature as of now. And that was a very informative one, ma'am. Can I take up some questions which are there in the comment box?
sure, sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Just ask me the
uh,
questions and I'll respond.
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I saw a question from Suman Prasad. Can we see eco-criticism with the ambit of trauma studies?
Right, that's a very interesting question. So, Kathy Caruth is one of the important trauma specialists that we keep talking about. Um, and in fact, there have been some attempts to link the idea of trauma with the idea of ecological examination. So, for instance, when I mentioned Rob Nixon, right, and the environmentalism of the poor, one of the things that he engages is with the idea of what he calls long dyings. Long dyings. So, by long dyings, he's talking about what you might call slow trauma, the gradual accretion of despair in certain ecological communities. He's talking not just about non-human environments. He's talking about even environments, human environments. The kind of despair that you find in subaltern communities with the accretion of slow violence, right? And therefore, he talks about trauma and long dying. So, yes, certainly you can combine the study of trauma with the study with eco-critical examinations. Yes.
Uh, hope ma'am has answered Suman. Like the next question is from Dr. Srinivasan Krishnamurthy. Eco-criticism failed to crystallize in 1970s like feminism and Marxism, Marxist criticism, but got surfaced only in 1990s. What is your prediction of eco-criticism in the present century?
Okay, so this is a very interesting question because I, first of all, want to engage with why we did not seem to be engaging with ecological problems um, before the 19th. I mean, it was surfaced any kind of recognition as a discipline, right? So that it received disciplinary status only in the 1990s, right? And this is because, as I mentioned in my talk, it was because we were mired, literary studies as a whole was mired in theory, right? So now I think there is a greater awareness. I was telling you about ASLI, right? And I founded the ASLI ASEAN. And so every 2 years, we run a conference here, right? And I must tell you that it is astounding the kind of engagement we have from all the scholars in the region, right? It's not just Singapore, it's just not Malaysia, it's Cambodia, Laos, Thailand. We have eco critics in all of these countries, and they're all working very, very hard. The Philippines, you name it, all of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they're very heavily engaged. And this is just a chapter of ASLI, right? Of course, there are regular conferences every 2 years in the United States in the umbrella organization ASLI. And I will tell you, the last time I went to ASLI, about that was last year, 2019, there were 1,800 participants. Presenters, I'm not talking about participants as in people who just attended. Presenters, there were 1,800 scholars from around the world who are presenting in the conference. So that will give you an idea of the level of engagement there is across, humanities and around the world. So I will say, I will confidently predict at this point in time that a great awareness has now come up about the importance and significance of studying human relationship to non-human nature. So I think eco-criticism is here to stay, and it will be one of the most prominent fields in the future in literary studies.
Thank you, ma'am. That question answers two or three questions which were also, so the same answer can be applied for that also. I'll take
Okay.
one more question, like that is from Ilanko Nadeshan. He's asking, can you give a view of urban ecology in the context of Singapore?
I see. Okay, so urban ecologies basically looks at various different aspects of ecology. So one of the major things that urban ecologies is to look at how different aspects of the urban environment connect with each other, right? So this can be studied from so many different angles, right? So one of the ways that literature engages with urban ecologies is, of course, to look at literary texts that engage with the idea of the city. And then, therefore, it examines these literary texts that is about the city, and then it connects with the idea of how these different ecologies connect. You can also talk about urban ecologies in connecting two cities, for instance, right? So you can study urban ecologies in a myriad of ways. Now, if you had to look at Singapore, of course, there have been a lot of studies on urban ecologies pertaining to Singapore, particularly from the geographers. So our geography department is very active in looking at urban ecologies. But we in the Department of English Language and Literature, when we look at urban ecologies, we look at it from the perspective of eco-criticism. And so we have looked at the formation of ecologies, the problems with the formation of the city called Singapore. So let me give you a very specific example that might help you understand some of the work. So in my most recent book that I'm just about to publish, one of the chapters is about precisely the history of the urban ecology of Singapore. And I have taken two books for that. One is by Meera Chand, and it is it's called A Different Sky. And the other book is by Su Chen Christine Lim, and this is called A River Song. Now, Meera Chand's novel is historical. It's basically tracing the history of Singapore. So, in a way, and especially the Second World War and the First World War. So, we actually look at how Singapore as an urban center grew and how it developed and how it was impacted by the world wars. Now, complementary to this is Su Chen Lim's A River Song. Here, she's talking about post colonial Singapore, Singapore after independence, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when Lee Kuan Yew was president of Singapore and he ordered the Clean River campaign, right? And how there was a whole, shall we say, community of river dwellers. They were called the river people of Singapore. They lived in bumboats in the 60s and 70s. They lived in bumboats on the river. And therefore, Lee Kuan Yew rehoused them. He built housing development board houses for them and gave it to them practically free of cost, and rehoused them, and he cleaned the Singapore River. Now, the Singapore River today is pristine, right? And it's one of the greatest sources of potable water. And also, the Singapore River, on its banks, we have all these beautiful restaurants, and it's kind of mimics the French Riviera. So we can see the benefits of it. But what Christine Su Chen Lim is talking about is the way in which the local ecology of the bumboat people, the local ecology of the river people was disturbed by this governmental, well intentioned project, but how it disturbed ecologies. So this looks at one sector of urban ecology. Right? So in these ways, you can find that you can study urban ecologies from a multitude of perspectives.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. That was a real thing. Like we are all experiencing. The people who are in the village areas are shifted to different places for nation development process. So it happens. We have to compromise certain things, but not nature. Anyhow, we have some more questions that is there in the chat box, but I think I can post it to you in through your mail as the time is running short. So I'll hand over the session to Dr. Manjula to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Radhika. And good evening, everyone. Once again, this is Dr. Manjula proposing the vote of thanks. Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful start on the preeminent topic, eco-criticism, because traditionally literature is viewed as a depiction of human life in society. And your elaboration on eco-criticism paved way for us to understand depiction of life in relation to nature. And I strongly believe this would pave way for many to understand the significance of literature and the literary studies. And one important thing is, ma'am, though everyone is aware of global warming and other global catastrophes, your session today threw light on these animistic culture, hierarchical dualism, privileged speakers and the silenced, where nature herself or himself is personified and being mishandled by humans. Humans, the greatest predators on earth. And I believe this session would be a great eye opener for mankind to live in harmony with anything that coexists with us. And secondly, I would like to thank our management, principal, the faculty team, and more specifically the Department of Visual Communication for their continuous support and motivation. And next, I would like to thank our participants, without whose continuous support it's very difficult for us to hold such sessions. Thank you everyone once again. And we have few more sessions for the next 2 days. So we have two more sessions on Friday and Saturday. So please do join us for the session and encourage and motivate it, and let's learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bashini, and it was a great pleasure. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Bye-bye.